Some stories begin with a bang, but this one started with a whisper. On a gray Tuesday, I wandered into the city's central library, drawn by an impulse I couldn't explain. The third-floor archives were silent, heavy with forgotten histories. As I walked the aisles, a sense of unease crept in, like the archives themselves were watching. My eyes landed on a single, unremarkable box labeled Unsolved Cases, 1990 to 1995. My heart raced as I reached for it, not knowing I was about to open a door to a past I never knew was mine. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I opened the box. Inside, a single manila folder stamped homicide. The date on the file matched a summer from my youth, one I barely remembered. I untied the string, revealing a black and white crime scene photo, a woodland police tape, a world away from the library's peace. The reports inside mentioned places I knew, diners, the old reservoir, names from my past. The case felt less like a random file and more like a ghost from my own life. The boundaries between my memories and the file began to blur. I was no longer just a reader, I was part of the story. My initials, typed, then redacted, appeared next to the word witness. I had no memory of being interviewed, no connection to a murder investigation. But there they were again, on a list of suspects, and again under known associates. Victim, witness, suspect. My initials everywhere, hidden but present. The silence of the archive pressed in. Was this a mistake or a message? The file felt personal, as if it had waited for me. I was the missing piece in a story I didn't remember, and now, I had to find out why. I spread the pages out, piecing together the timeline. The victim, Catherine, a young woman from my own era. The investigation was exhaustive. Interviews, rumors, dead ends. The case went cold, filed away, waiting for new information. But the redacted initials, my initials, kept surfacing. This wasn't just a cold case, it was my case. The file had waited decades for someone to look closer. For me. The redactions were deliberate, not random. My initials, hidden but pressed into the paper, connected me to the case as witness, suspect, and associate. Why erase a name from a forgotten file? To protect or to conceal? The context made no sense, unless my identity was the secret. I couldn't remember Catherine, but the file insisted I knew her. It was as if someone had redacted not just the file, but my memory. The truth was buried in black ink, and somewhere in the shadows of my own mind, and now I had to uncover it. The file contained a marked-up photocopy of a town map. A red circle highlighted Miller's Ravine, where the body was found. Blue X's dotted the landscape, labeled with dates and notes. Diner, Reservoir Lookout, Old Mill. These were landmarks from my youth, places where my friends and I had spent countless hours. Seeing them marked in a murder investigation was unsettling. The file contained statements that brought these places to life. A witness at the old mill described a figure running from the woods. I remembered the old mill. We used to dare each other to go inside. Staring at the map, I felt a sense of temporal vertigo. Two versions of the past were overlapping, set in the same places at the same time, yet they felt like different universes. The map felt like a guide to my own lost history. The deeper I went into the file, the more the redactions began to feel like a language of their own. They weren't just covering names, they were shaping the narrative, creating deliberate ambiguity. I found a transcript of an interview with one of Catherine's closest friends. Her words were full of grief and confusion. She spoke of a new person Catherine had been seeing, someone secretive, someone none of her other friends had met. When the detective asked for a name, the transcript simply read, redacted. The friend then went on to describe this person, and her description was chillingly vague. He was quiet, she said, intense. He seemed nice, but there was something sad about him. This description hung in the air of the silent archive. It was generic enough to fit anyone, yet it felt unnervingly specific. I tried to see myself in those words. Was I quiet? Intense? Maybe. I was a moody teenager like many others. I wrote bad poetry and listened to somber music. I cultivated a certain amount of mystique because I thought it made me interesting. The description was a phantom, and I couldn't be sure if I was fitting myself to it, or if it was truly a reflection of a boy I used to be. The black bar on the page was a mirror, and looking into it I saw a distorted version of my younger self staring back. Then, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a supplemental report, filed weeks after the initial investigation had stalled. It detailed an anonymous tip that had come in through a payphone. The caller, a man, claimed the police had the wrong idea. He said the person they should be looking at was not a suspect but a witness who was too scared to talk. He mentioned someone who was at Miller's Ravine that night, someone who saw everything. The detective asked for the witness's name. The transcript noted a long pause, then the caller had spoken a single name before hanging up. That name, of course, was redacted, a long black rectangle of pure dread. This changed everything. The redactions for witness and suspect were on separate lists, presented as different possibilities, but this anonymous tip suggested they could be the same person, a witness who, by virtue of what they saw, had become a suspect, or a witness who was being framed, or, most terrifying of all, a killer who was trying to insert himself into the investigation as a witness to throw off suspicion. The black bars were no longer separate data points, they were converging, twisting together into a knot of terrifying complexity, and my initials were at the center of that knot. I was no longer just a name on a list, I was the central mystery of the entire case. The file lay spread around me, a tarot reading of a past I didn't know I'd lived. The library's silence was accusatory. I closed my eyes, trying to force my way back to that summer. But memory is a treacherous thing. It's not a perfect recording, with inconvenient details often left on the cutting room floor. My mind drifted through fragmented scenes. These were my memories, and felt completely disconnected from the brutal narrative of the homicide file. The file said I was there, but my memory offered nothing, just fog. My own brain had chosen to build a wall around it, to lock it away in a vault and throw away the key. Or was I protecting myself from something I had done? Was there also fear? Guilt? The file claimed a connection to a murder, but my memory was stubbornly silent. I packed the file, a cold dread settling in. I smuggled the folder out of the library, hidden between books. The city seemed alien. The file was toxic, my secret. Back in my apartment, I laid the documents out. I stared at my reflection. Were they the same eyes? A suspect? A killer? How could I have no memory of a murder? What if the memory was never there? If the file was true, my own mind had to be the liar. Who was the person staring back from the mirror? Or was he a fiction, hiding a dark truth? The file questioned my identity. A stranger was living inside my skin. My investigation shifted to the physical evidence in the file. I needed something concrete. I pored over the crime scene reports and evidence inventory. Then, one item caught my eye. Item number 7. A silver-toned Zippo-style lighter. It was a small detail, but for me, it was a lightning bolt. I used to have a lighter just like that. And there, I found it. Was this the one from the scene? It looked exactly like mine. It proved nothing, and yet it felt like everything. It was the first tangible link. A duplicate, or perhaps the original, had been found near a dead body. Suddenly, other details began to glow with a new significance. I couldn't trust my own mind, and the physical evidence was a constellation of circumstantial dread. I needed another perspective. I needed to know what other people remembered. The file contained a list of all the individuals the police had interviewed. Friends of Catherine, my own high school classmates. Names I hadn't thought of in over 20 years. Thanks to the relentless connectivity of social media, it wasn't hard to find some of them. Most had moved away, building lives in other cities, other states. They had families, careers, mortgages. They had left that small town and that dark summer far behind. I hesitated for a long time, my finger hovering over the send message button. What could I possibly say? My first message was to a woman named Sarah, who had been one of Catherine's closest friends. Her witness statement in the file was long and emotional. I kept my message vague. I told her I was a writer, researching a book about our hometown in the 90s, and that I'd come across the old case file. I asked if she would be willing to talk about that time, just for background color. It was a lie, but it felt necessary. To my surprise, she replied within an hour. Her response was cautious, tinged with a sadness that was still palpable even through a computer screen. She agreed to a phone call. She said she rarely thought about it anymore, but that some things you never really forget. Our conversation was difficult. Her voice was strained as she spoke about Catherine, about the bright, funny girl she had lost. I listened, letting her talk, not wanting to push. Then I gently steered the conversation towards the investigation. I asked about the people the police had interviewed. I asked about the rumors that had been flying around school. She sighed, a heavy, weary sound. She said the police had talked to everyone. They were so lost, she said. They suspected all the boys, especially the quiet ones, the ones who kept to themselves. My heart hammered in my chest. Do you remember any of them specifically? I asked. My own voice, barely a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. There was one boy, she said finally, her voice lower now. I can't remember his name. He was in our year. He was always writing things in a little notebook, kind of intense. Catherine... She thought he was interesting. She'd met up with him a few times, secretly. At the old mill, I think. She told me he was sweet, but sad. After it happened, I told the police about him. I felt so guilty, like I was pointing a finger. But I was so scared. I never saw him again after that summer. It was like he just vanished. Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. A boy who was quiet, intense, who wrote in a notebook. A boy who met Catherine in secret at the old mill. A boy who vanished after that summer. She didn't say my name, but she didn't have to. She had just described the version of me that I kept hidden. The version of me I barely admitted to myself. And the detail about vanishing? It wasn't true, I hadn't vanished. I'd finished high school and gone to a state college a few hours away. But from her perspective, from the tightly knit world of our high school, maybe it had looked like a disappearance. A quiet exit in the aftermath of a tragedy. I ended the call, my mind reeling. Sarah's memory wasn't a perfect objective record. It was colored by her own grief and the passage of time. But it aligned with the file in terrifying ways. It gave context to the redaction under known associates. It gave life to the vague description of the secret person Catherine was seeing. It was a different kind of evidence, not physical, but testimonial. And it pointed directly at me. The file was a skeleton and Sarah's memories were the flesh she was putting on its bones. The creature that was taking shape was a monster, and it had my face. This new information sent me back to the boxes of my old things, this time, with a specific target. The little notebook. I knew exactly which one she meant. A black, spiral-bound notebook I had filled with terrible, angst-ridden poetry and philosophical musings. I found it tucked inside the sleeve of an old record album. My handwriting, a tight, spiky script, filled every page. I flipped through it, my cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and dread. It was a portrait of a lonely, melodramatic teenager. But as I read, I started to see something else. I saw the sadness Sarah had mentioned, the intensity, and then I found it. Tucked between a bad poem about rain and a quote from a philosopher I didn't understand, was an entry that was different. It wasn't dated, but the ink was darker, pressed harder into the page. It wasn't a poem or a reflection. It was a description, a frantic, fragmented account of a night in the woods. It spoke of shouting, of running, of the metallic taste of fear in the back of the throat. It mentioned the glint of something silver falling to the ground. It mentioned a girl's name, a name I'd supposedly never known. Catherine. It was a memory. Not in my head, but here in ink, in my own hand. A memory I had recorded, and then completely, utterly forgotten. It was there, in my own handwriting. A confession locked away, not in my mind, but on a brittle, yellowing page. The shock left me breathless. My hands began to tremble, threatening to tear the fragile paper. Now I held the proof that this stranger was me. It was a primary source document from the scene of a crime I was somehow at the center of. I smoothed the page flat, my fingers tracing the frantic letters I had written decades ago. It read like a telegram from a war zone. This wasn't a story, it was a memory I had transcribed. This single page was the Rosetta Stone for the entire mystery. This discovery had cleaved my life in two. Now my memories were suspect. I had discovered that the piece I was missing was the most important one of all. I forced myself to read the entry again, and then a third time, my eyes scanning the chaotic script, trying to impose order on the fragmented thoughts. The words were a jumble, sentences crashing into each other without punctuation. It was a stream of consciousness poured onto the page in a state of pure panic. Phrases leaped out at me, each one a fresh stab of fear, too dark to see. The sound of the shouting, running through the trees, branches scratching, fell down, mud on my hands. It was a sensory explosion, a collection of terrifying images and sounds that my mind refused to conjure, but which my own hand had documented with chilling clarity. The narrative, if you could call it that, lacked any clear sequence. It was a loop of fear. It described arriving at a place, the woods, but didn't say why. It spoke of an argument, voices raised in anger, but didn't identify who was arguing or what they were saying. The words conveyed a powerful sense of being a bystander, a witness on the periphery of a conflict that was rapidly spiraling out of control. I saw myself not as a participant, but as someone caught in the crossfire, a deer in the headlights. The overwhelming emotion that bled through the ink was not anger or malice. It was terror, pure, unadulterated terror. As I dissected each phrase, I felt a strange and horrifying sensation. It was like a phantom limb. I couldn't remember the feeling of the branches scratching my face, but reading the words, I could almost feel a ghostly sting on my cheeks. I couldn't recall the smell of the damp earth, but the phrase mud on my hands made me want to look at my own palms, half expecting to see them stained with dirt. These weren't my memories, and yet they felt like they belonged to me. They were echoes in an empty room, proof that a sound had once been made, even if I hadn't been there to hear it. My body seemed to remember what my mind had forgotten. The entry was a nightmare committed to paper, and like most nightmares, it was frustratingly vague on the most crucial details. Who else was there? What was the argument about? What happened after the shouting? The page was a snapshot of a single moment of high terror, but the before and after were missing. It was a single terrifying frame from a motion picture I couldn't watch. This page, which shouldn't exist, was both a revelation and a dead end. It confirmed my presence at the scene, solidifying my connection to the crime. But it offered no clear answers, only deepening the mystery and intensifying the horror of my own mental blackout. Among the chaotic scrawl, one detail stood out: the glint of silver falling. The phrase was underlined twice. Item number 7. The silver-toned lighter found near the victim. The lighter I used to own. The connection was undeniable. My own words tied my possession to the crime. I picked up the lighter, click, click, click. Now it sounded like a ticking clock, a breadcrumb for investigators. It was leading me back to a version of myself I did not want to meet. A visual snapshot seared into the brain during a moment of extreme trauma. This was a memory. The words were a ghost, and the lighter was its anchor. Why did I run? Was I running from something I had seen, or something I had done? After that, there was nothing. I scanned the page one last time, my eyes raw from staring at my own spidery handwriting. I was convinced I had extracted every possible clue from the frantic text. But then I saw it. Tucked away at the very bottom of the page, almost lost in the shadow of the spiral binding, was a single word. It wasn't part of the main, panicked entry. It was written separately in a slightly calmer, though still shaken hand. It was a name. Catherine. Just her name, written once. Not shouted, not cried, but simply stated. A fact. A final, devastating piece of the puzzle that was my own forgotten past. Until that moment, Catherine had been an abstraction. A name in a file, a grainy photograph of a stranger. But seeing her name written in my own hand, on this page, in this context, made her real. It was an intimate act, writing someone's name. It implied a connection, a familiarity. It confirmed what Sarah had told me on the phone, what the file had hinted at. I knew her. My known associate's redaction wasn't a mistake. We had met. We had been there, in that place, together. The wall of amnesia that had stood for decades began to crumble. Not with a crash, but with the quiet, devastating force of this single written name. Why had I written her name? It seemed like an anchor, a focal point in the storm of panic that filled the rest of the page. It was as if, after the chaos of running and falling, after the terror had subsided just enough to allow for a single, coherent thought, her name was the only thing that remained. Was it an accusation? Was it a lament? Was it the name of a victim, written by a horrified witness? Or was it the name of a victim, written by a remorseful perpetrator? The single word offered no answers. It only hung there, suspended in a terrible, silent space between guilt and grief. The presence of her name on this page connected all the dots. It linked the boy with the notebook, the secret meetings at the old mill, the argument in the woods, and the final, tragic outcome. It was the missing piece that made the entire narrative of the case file snap into focus. The redactions, the anonymous tip, the circumstantial evidence, it all pointed to a central figure, a boy who was there, who knew her, who fled the scene. And that boy was me. The notebook didn't explicitly say what happened to her, but it didn't have to. I was there, I ran, and she died. The equation was simple, brutal, and inescapable. Holding the notebook, I tried once more to break through the wall in my mind. I closed my eyes and concentrated, trying to unlock the door to that lost memory. I focused on the glint of silver, on her name, Catherine. For a fleeting moment I felt something, a flicker. It was like a radio signal struggling to break through a wall of impenetrable static. The static roared back, louder than before, defensive. It felt as if a part of my own consciousness was fighting to keep the door shut, to protect me from the truth. My mind had sealed it off, leaving only these faint, ghostly traces. What could be so terrible that my mind would choose to erase it completely? The kind of trauma that might cause the mind to shatter a memory is the trauma of one's own actions. Was the static in my head a shield or a cage? The memory of the event was locked behind a wall of mental static I could not breach. The page that shouldn't exist had given me everything and nothing. My obsession with the file consumed me. Sleep offered no escape. My apartment became a claustrophobic evidence room. I needed cold, hard facts. I turned to the autopsy report. The report was stark, brutal, and precise, detailing the cause of death, evidence of a struggle in the forest. I felt sorrow for the girl in the grainy photograph. The report noted defensive wounds, confirming a desperate fight. The autopsy didn't exonerate me, but it didn't condemn me either. Buried in the toxicological analysis, I found a strange detail: pollen grains. Pollen from wildflowers that grew near the old mill, the place Catherine went to meet the secret boy. The file was now pointing to it with a silent, botanical finger. The old mill. My notebook entry mentioned the woods, Miller's Ravine, but the pollen suggested another location. The night started somewhere else. Was the argument at the derelict factory? This complicated my memory, adding geography to my amnesia. I was missing a sequence of events. The blank space in my mind was growing larger. I returned to the witness statements, looking for what wasn't there. I was reading the negative space. There were hours unaccounted for. Hours when she could have been at the old mill, with me. The police had no witnesses who could fill that time. A black hole that was exactly my size and shape. I focused on the smallest details, convinced the truth was hiding in plain sight. I reread the report from the couple who heard a car speeding away. They mentioned the car's radio was on, playing a song by a band I had been obsessed with. The odds of another car speeding away at that time, blasting that song, were astronomically small. It was a cultural fingerprint, a piece of my identity left at the scene. This detail triggered a sense memory of driving at night, windows down, that song playing. The memory of escape was now linked with fleeing a crime scene. Every note felt like an accusation. Was my entire identity just a constellation of incriminating details? I was afraid I would find a monster. I thought I had seen all the redactions, but as I reshuffled the pages, a single sheet fluttered to the floor. It was a property log, detailing personal effects found on the victim. A heartbreaking list, a single earring, a house key, a movie ticket. But the last item made the air leave my lungs, one folded piece of notebook paper, contents redacted. This was it. The final, most devastating redaction. Catherine had a note in her pocket. The police had chosen to redact its contents. Why? Unless the contents pointed directly to someone. Unless the note was from me. My mind flashed back to my notebook. Had I written her a note? I had no memory of it. I had given her a note, and she had it in her pocket when she died. The contents were so incriminating that someone had decided they needed to be buried. This final redaction was the keystone. It all led back to this. Words that I had written. I was peeling back the layers of myself, a message that may have gotten a girl killed. The file had given me one last clue, and it was the most terrible one of all. The mystery was about what I had said. The case file sits on my table, a Pandora's box I can never close. The investigation turned inward, and the cold case I have been trying to solve is me. I am a ghost in my own story, a protagonist with amnesia. Every clue leads back to the boy I was, a boy I no longer know but cannot escape. Yet the final, crucial piece of evidence is missing, the memory itself. I am trapped in a permanent state of suspicion. This is the hope I cling to in the darkest hours of the night. The question of what was on that final, redacted note haunts me most. The contents of that note hold the key, but it is a truth I can never know. The file remains open, an unsolvable mystery that defines my past, corrupts my present, and darkens all of my tomorrows. Days have bled into weeks since I opened that file. I have considered going to the police to confess, but what would I confess to? Another story built on the terrifying architecture of the circumstantial evidence I have unearthed. I am paralyzed by a truth I can feel but cannot see. The silence is the hardest part. I listen for a voice, an image, a flicker of that lost night to break through. I am hoping for an echo in the silence, a ghostly whisper that might finally tell me what happened in those woods. Victim, witness, or suspect. The file offers evidence for all three. The story of Catherine, the girl with the kind eyes, remains unfinished, her justice denied. I am bound to her memory by a shared moment in the dark that she did not survive and I cannot remember. The terrible secret he has kept from me for all these years. The silence in my mind is his final victory.